this week. We're happy about it. This morning we are going to tell a story. Actually, I'm going to tell a few different stories, but we are going to read a story from the Bible, and it's going to be 2 full chapters. But just like the youth, I have faith we can do this too. So we are going to be reading a story from Joshua chapter 3 and 4. And I just invite you to listen to the story as it progresses. Listen to the story that is being told. So Joshua was up early and on his way from Shittim, and all the people of Israel were with him. He arrived at the Jordan and camped before crossing over. After 3 days, leaders went through the camp and gave out orders to the people. When you see the covenant chest of God, your God, carried by the Levitical priests, start moving. Follow it. Make sure you keep a proper distance between you and it, about half a mile. Be sure now to keep your distance, and you'll see clearly the route to take. You've never been on this road before. Then Joshua addressed the people, "Sanctify yourselves. Tomorrow God will work miracle wonders among you." Joshua instructed the priests, "Take up the chest of the covenant and step out before the people." So they took it up and processed before the people. God said to Joshua, "This very day I will begin to make you great in the eyes of all Israel. They'll see for themselves that I'm with you in the same way that I was with Moses. You will command the priests who are carrying the chest of the covenant. When you come to the edge of the Jordan waters, stand there on the riverbank." Then Joshua addressed the people of Israel, "Attention, listen to what God, your God, has to say. This is how you'll know that God is alive among you. He will completely dispossess before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. Look at what's before you, the chest of the covenant. Think of it. The master of the entire earth is crossing the Jordan as you watch. Now take 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. When the soles of the feet of the priests carrying the chest of God, master of all the earth, touch the Jordan's water, the flow of water will be stopped. The water coming from upstream will pile up in a heap." And that's what happened. The people left their tents to cross the Jordan, led by the priests carrying the chest of the covenant. When the priests got to the Jordan and their feet touched the water at the edge, the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the harvests, the flow of water stopped. It piled up in a heap a long way off at Adam, which is near Zarethan. The river went dry all the way down to Arabah Sea, the Salt Sea, and the people crossed, facing Jericho. And there they stood. Those priests carrying the chest of the covenant stood firmly planted on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground. Finally, the whole nation was across the Jordan, and not one wet foot. When the whole nation was finally across, God spoke to Joshua, "Select 12 men from the people, a man from each tribe, and tell them, from right here, the middle of the Jordan, where the feet of the priests are standing firm, take 12 stones. Carry them across with you and set them down in the place where you camp tonight." Joshua called out the 12 men whom he selected from the people of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. Joshua directed them, "Cross to the middle of the Jordan and take your place in front of the chest of God, your God. Each of you heft a stone to your shoulder, a stone for each of the tribes of the people of Israel. So you'll have something later to mark the occasion. When your children ask you, 'What are these stones to you?' you'll say, 'The flow of the Jordan was stopped in front of the chest of the covenant of God as it crossed the Jordan.' Stopped in its tracks. These stones are a permanent memorial for the people of Israel." The people of Israel did exactly as Joshua commanded. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, a stone for each of the 12 tribes, just as God had instructed Joshua, carried them across with them to camp, and set them down there. Joshua set up the 12 stones taken from the middle of the Jordan that had marked the place where the priests who had carried the chest of the covenant had stood. They are still there today. The priests carrying the chest continued standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything God had instructed Joshua to tell the people to do was done, confirming what Moses had instructed Joshua. The people crossed, no one dawdled. When the crossing of all the people was complete, they watched as the chest of the covenant and the priests crossed over. The Reubenites, Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh had crossed over in battle formation in front of the people of Israel, obedient to Moses' instructions. All told, about 40,000 armed soldiers crossed over before God to the plains of Jericho, ready for battle. God made Joshua great that day in the sight of all Israel. They were in awe of him just as they had been in awe of Moses all his life. God told Joshua, "Command the priests carrying the chest of the testimony to come up from the Jordan." Joshua commanded the priests, "Come up out of the Jordan." They did it. The priests carrying God's chest of the covenant came up from the middle of the Jordan. As soon as the soles of the priests' feet touched dry land, the Jordan's waters resumed their flow within the banks, just as before. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. They set up camp at the Gilgal, the circle, to the east of Jericho. Joshua erected a monument at the Gilgal using the 12 stones that had been taken from the Jordan. And then he told the people of Israel, "In the days to come, when your children ask their fathers, 'What are these stones doing here?' tell your children this. Israel crossed over this Jordan on dry ground. Yes, God, your God, dried up the Jordan's waters for you until you had crossed, just as God, your God, did the Red Sea, which has dried up before us until we had crossed. This was so that everybody on earth would recognize how strong God's rescuing hand is, and so that you would hold God in solemn reverence always." Now, I've never really done this kind of sermon before, but essentially I'm going to share with you the same basic message of a sermon I heard when I was in high school. And I wish that I could remember the name of the pastor that came, but the church I was attending had invited a guest preacher to come and speak that morning, and he came and spoke, and it is a message that I still remember to this day. He delivered this a message about the importance of creating reminders about the stories of what God has done in our lives. And he read this passage to us. Now, this guest pastor, there's a reason that he traveled around and speaking. He was eloquent, and he used this really nifty preaching device where he repeated the phrase, "Sit down and let me tell you a story." And he repeated it at key points during his message, to the point eventually the whole congregation was saying it at the times that they were supposed to say it. He spoke about this story, and the point of his story was that we need to create reminders, our own piles of rocks, to speak of the wonderful things that God has done for us. He spoke about how we create these opportunities that we not only remind ourselves, but we might be able to tell others when they see the pile of rocks and they ask, "What does this mean?" Then he could say, "Sit down and I'll tell you a story." Now, I'm not eloquent and I'm not practiced enough with all these nifty little devices and preaching tricks so that you guys can chime in when it's time. But I do want to share this story with you because his message resonated with me so strongly that now I still remember it. And not just because he was a good speaker and not just because he had us so engaged that we were able to chime in at the right spots with the right words, even though I do think that that was helpful. But the reason that I remembered it so much is because it was the first time where someone shared a message that revealed that our purpose in coming to these stories that we hear in the Bible, our purpose for coming to hear about what God has done, is not to remind us to be good moral people. It's not a book that just tells us how we are supposed to do things and to make sure it keeps us in check by making us feel bad at the right times when we don't measure up. It was one of the first times that someone spoke about how the Bible is telling us stories of who God is and why that matters to us. It was one of the first times that someone suggested that sharing the good news of Jesus was not about having a convincing argument. It was one of the first times that someone suggested to me that sharing the good news of Jesus wasn't about trying to make somebody else feel a certain way. It was simply sharing these stories about what God had done. Not only stories that we had heard from the past, but stories that we knew for ourselves. The focus was not on me or us. It was not look at me and try to live like me. The focus was listen to what God has done. Listen to how amazing God is. And this message that he preached all those years ago when I was still in high school left everyone with a challenge to go and create your own pile of rocks that would cause people to stop and ask, what does this mean? And then for us to have that opportunity to remember what God had done and for us to share the story of what God had done. Now, I remember the week after this message was shared, the youth group at that time, hi Kiki, the youth group at the time, and I think I was actually likely one of the key instigators in this incident, but the youth group decided that we were going to attend church extra early that next week, and we went and we found a bunch of rocks and we piled them right in front of that front entrance door. And so you couldn't miss it. You had to, you could barely open the door without the pile of rocks, and you had to go around it. And we thought this was awesome. It's going to make us have a conversation about what that message meant. We were super excited. Unfortunately, this was not well received at all by the church, and there were several people who were quite irritated that us youth were being so disrespectful by moving the rocks and making it difficult for people to get into church. Anyways, I'm sharing all of this right now because I want to share with you why it meant so much to me. I think that there's something significant about this idea that the same God of creation, the same God of the Old Testament, the same God who came as Jesus to live with his creation, the same God who came and used stories when he was teaching during his ministry on earth, the same God who came to die as a sacrifice and rose again, that is the same God, the same constant God who is also a continued presence in our life. He is there with us in the same consistent manner that he's always been. And he speaks to us in the same way. The God who stopped the Jordan River, who made it so that his people could walk across, not just walk across and not have to go through the water, they walked across on dry land. That was the same God who asked his people to remember that story. He wanted them to remember it, and he wanted them to share and retell this powerful story of what a powerful God had done in providing for his people. That is the same God who tells us and works with us in the same way. This is the same God who came and died for us and rose again simply because he actually thought we were worth it. This is the same God who is still at continuous work in our life, who is powerfully and actively caring for us in consistent ways. And this is the same God who is hoping for us to see this and to have a willingness to remember for ourselves and to share those stories with others. Because that is what all of these stories are. It's who God is, what he has done, and that it is good for us to remember. I think we all have some favorite stories from the Bible, and I've asked the youth to share, but does anybody want to share what one of their favorite stories from the Bible is? Well, everybody's quiet. Yeah.
I love the story of Elijah. When
Yeah.
He was going through pretty severe depression.
Yeah.
And he was overwhelmed, and he just ran away from everything, and God just cared for him and just let him rest and spoke to him softly and gently.
Yeah, and said, here's a snack and take a nap. Yeah, I love that. God, that's how God spoke to him. I love it when God speaks to me that way too. That's a good one. Yeah. What's another story that anybody has? Favorite story? The story I was going to have the kids do in the kids' time was going to be the story of Jonah and the whale. I love that story. I find that to just be this thrilling idea of that's how God powerfully worked, not only in the life of Jonah, but in the life of all the people in Nineveh. That is such a celebratory story of a entire city that converted and transformed their lives for God, and they were called into that recognition of who God was. I think that's just a wonderful story. I love that story. I think lots of us have these stories that we remember. Maybe it's a parable, maybe it's a story of a miracle of what Jesus did, maybe it is an Old Testament story, but we all have these stories, and I think that it's good for us to remember that the common main character for all of those stories is God. Sometimes we go, oh, the story of David and Goliath is about David. No, it's not about David. It's about God. David's a part of the story. David is a significant part of who's there, but the main character in that story is God. At each of these stories, it tells us something about who God is. It gives us a picture, a revelation of his power, his patience, his provision, his mercy, his creativity. It reveals something of who God is. I think this is even the case with Paul's letters. I think sometimes we go ahead and we treat those books differently. We go ahead and look at them and we go, oh, wait a second. This is switched from being stories of God's active work in people's lives, and suddenly we start reading it like a legal document or as a how-to manual. And we start reading it different than the way that we read the whole rest of the Bible. But these are letters that tell a story too. These are letters that tell the story of Paul, his conversion story, and how God reached down and in a powerful way held his hand out to this man who was actively fighting against him. It tells the story of how God used Paul in a very powerful way to build relationships, to maintain relationships, and to establish this new relationship that he had with his bride, the new church. All of these stories that happen, even the letters that are tell these stories, all of them tell about who God is. It's the same God, the God of power, the God of patience, the God of provision and mercy and creativity. And all of these stories are told to remind us who God is, because I think we need reminding often. Just as the Bible tells us this consistent story of who God is in his creation, it also tells this very consistent story about how humanity, both as individuals and as a collective, are a very forgetful people. I don't think we're going to go through it all this morning because it's an entire sermon in itself, this journey of forgetfulness that we have traveled since creation. But it is fascinating to consider this theme that exists in the Bible too. It's a very consistent theme. And especially it's so highlighted in the book of Jeremiah, that it is the theme of people forgetting, specifically forgetting who God is. Sometimes we do clue in on the forgetting part, but we sometimes change it and we turn it into we've forgotten the rules, or we've forgotten the obligatory things that we're just supposed to remember because that's what you're supposed to do, like instructions for a new recipe or directions to a friend's new house. But that's not the same thing as the forgetting who God is. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we can admit that this is exactly what our problem is most of the time. It's not a problem that we struggle to remember what we're supposed to do or not supposed to do. It is that we forget who God is and all the things that he has done for us. We forget those moments that we know to be true of who God is. A few weeks ago at our Equip night that we were having, we were talking about how our faith in God comes about not because of things that we've learned or things that we can logically reason out. It doesn't become this head knowledge that is what causes our faith to be born into existence. Ultimately, our faith comes from some kind of experience that each of us has when God is revealed to us. Faith is not what we know. It's not what we think God should be or the things that we can list and argue about. Faith is from an experiential remembering of who God is. And this is why I can remember this sermon from several decades ago, is because it was a message that spoke to me this idea that I needed to be reminded of who God is, that he is real. And I know this to be true, not because of years of Sunday school, not because I attended VBS, not because I had been on a mission trip, not because I was reading the Bible and I know that I could confidently say I had read the whole thing through at least 3 times. That was something I was very proud of, and I don't know why. But that was not why I knew God was real. Those were not the things that my faith were grounded in. The reason I can remember this single sermon is because it reminded me that my experience and my faith was because of what I had known to be true of God from the moments I had had with him. Because I had had these experiences of praying with him when I was all alone, and he met me in that space, of him speaking to me in a way that I knew wasn't just me internally dialoguing with myself. I knew from the times that he had answered prayers in such a way that it was obvious it was God who had done it. I knew God to be real. My faith was born from a place of the times that I had had this fulfillment of being connected to God, because that's what I was created to be. I was created to be me in connection with my Creator. It was from the stories that I'd heard others people tell me about what God had done in their lives, but also from the stories I had lived for myself. Things that could be described as miraculous, but things that you just knew were done in the glory of God. It was the stories of the times that I did forget God. Those times when I stopped seeking his voice, or I was just complacent and lazy and I just had forgotten about it. And I didn't even realize I wasn't even paying attention to him anymore. And it wasn't until I realized how empty and lost I was feeling that I realized I had forgotten who he was, and I had to clue in and remember. And when I turned around, I saw that he had never left. It was just me ignoring him, but he was still always there. It was from the stories that I had experienced, the times that I had experienced darkness and dreadful experiences, but I found peace in those moments that could not be explained, simply because he was there with me through it all. It's all of these things, all of these stories that showed God's patience, his power, his provision, his mercy, his creativity. And the stories that spoke the most powerfully to me were not necessarily the stories that happened to someone else, although I love those stories too. But the stories that reminded me the most significant, and the stories that seemed to be the best for me to share with others, were the ones that happened to me. They were the ones that helped me not to forget. They were the ones that when I shared them with somebody else, I could tell them in a different way. They were the stories that were the basis of my faith. It was to simply show other people and to remind myself that I can have this experiential moment of finding God, not in my mind, but in my life. So in closing of this message, my encouragement is for you to find a pile of rocks. These reminders, these things that prompt you to tell a story of who God is and what he's doing, what he's already done. And you can find them. You can find these stories in the Bible. You can find them when you're listening to others. And I think last week's testimony that Bill shared is a great example. And I'm going to say this as the best compliment I know how. Bill is a wonderful example of being a pile of rocks. It is good. It is good for us to seek out those times where we can find those stories, those examples, but it is the best when we can find them in our own lives. Sometimes we might have to dig because we've covered them over. We forgot where we left them. But they are powerful reminders of what God has done. And when we seek them out, we find them and we retell those stories. We retell those stories for ourselves, we retell them for others, and we tell these stories so we can accomplish what Joshua asked for those 12 stones set near the River Jordan to do, so that everybody on earth would recognize how strong God's rescuing hand is, and so that we would hold God in solemn reverence always. Please join me as we pray. God, we are grateful for who you are, for the fact that we praise a very real, a very close God, a God who is here with us and has consistently been with us, present with us in powerful, provisional, merciful ways since the beginning, since you created us, God. And we know this, not just from the stories that we hear and the things that we've seen and the ways that we are reminded in the lives of others, but we know this because of what we experience for ourselves with you. We hold on to those things. We retell those stories. God, I pray that if we have forgotten that, we find ways to retell those stories for ourselves, for each other, so that we can be reminded of who you are, of how you care for us, of why we can trust you, why we believe in you in the first place. God, we thank you that this is how you continually reach out to us, that even though we know we are going to forget, we may be forgetting right now, we are going to forget again in the future. That's fine. You're still there. You're still present. And you will continue to have those piles of rocks in our lives so that when we see them and we spot them, we take a moment and we go, oh yeah, I remember. I remember now who God is and what he's done. God, thank you for being the God who loves us so much. And we pray that as we go forward in this week, that we pay attention to your voice, that we seek out your presence, that we remember who you are, God, And we hold fast to that. God, we pray this for us this week. In your name, amen. So I'd like to have us close with a time of sharing and a time of prayer for one another. For those of you who got my message this week, there was a request